I don't always listen to podcasts, but when I do, I listen to STEM Talk, interviewing the most interesting people in the world of science and technology. Stay curious, my friends.
Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM
STEM
Talk.
Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society. Hi, I'm your host, Don Kernagis, and I'm here today with IHMC's director, Dr. Ken Ford.
Hi, Don. Good to be here with you to introduce the terrific interview that you and Tom Jones did with Dr. Joan Vernikos. Joan is a pioneer in understanding how living in a microgravity environment adversely affects the health of astronauts and the benefits of gravity for those of us on Earth. Living in space is, in several ways, like accelerated aging, and thus the experience of astronauts in space may be instructive for thinking about problems of aging, such as sarcopenia and osteoporosis.
Yeah, I really enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Vernikos. What a fascinating person. Before we get to today's interview, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we especially appreciate all the wonderful 5-star reviews that are piling up on iTunes.
As we announced in several earlier episodes, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continuously and carefully reviewing the iTunes reviews with an eye toward selecting the wittiest and lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk.
As always, if you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt. Today, our winning review was posted by someone who goes by the nickname Fellow Musician, and here's the review.
Unlike the majority of podcasts I find, STEM Talk is a long-format show with extremely in-depth discussions. I cannot believe how much serious information was packed into the first few episodes. A+.
Thank you, fellow musician, and all of the other STEM Talk listeners who have helped make STEM Talk get off to a great start.
Okay, now on to today's interview.
Dr. Joan Vernikos is former director of life sciences at NASA. She pioneered research on how living in a microgravity environment adversely affected the health of astronauts. Her research led her to believe that there were many similarities between the effects of microgravity on the physiology of astronauts living in space and the aging process here on Earth. In 1998, she was instrumental in the return to space of American hero John Glenn at the age of 77. Joan has published a series of books that present simple and effective plans for maintaining good health throughout life. Her most recent book, Sitting Kills, Moving Heals, was published in 2011. She is now finishing up a new book titled Designed to Move. This forthcoming book will show how sedentary lifestyles contribute to poor health and early death, and how movement that challenges gravity can dramatically improve health and longevity.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hi, Joan. This is Dawn Kernagis, and I'm here with Tom Jones. Welcome to STEM Talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Hello, Joan. This is Tom Jones with IHMC.
Hello, Tom.
I understand that your upbringing emphasized education, and your father was quite an inspiration to you. Can you tell us about this?
Yes, I learned by apprenticeship, which is the best way to learn. And he was a physician. He left as a young man of 17, got on a ship, went to France in the end of the 19th century. And he landed in Montpellier and went to the medical school without speaking a word of French and said, "Here I am, I'd like to be a doctor." And they said, okay. And he learned French on the job, went through medical school, went on to Paris and Liège and studied infectious diseases, as they were called then. And then someone said, "My boy, you need to go to a place where there's lots of it." And so he went to Egypt. And that's how come I ended up being born there. He was Greek, obviously, and he was 60 when I was born, so he had a lot of practice. And growing up in that environment, my older sister and I, it was expected that we would become professionals at a time when that was not the case. My sister became a pediatrician, and I chickened out the first time I went to the anatomy room, and and went into pharmacy and then went to London to get my degree in pharmacology. But what I learned from my father, which I think is fundamental to my approach in general, is that you listen and you ask questions and you diagnose. And this was a time when there weren't scans and MRIs and lab tests, and very few lab tests. And the diagnosis was a hands-on questions, looking at the patient and figuring out what was the problem. And he would discuss these cases at the dinner table, and we would ask questions, and he would ask us questions. What would we do in such a case? And so this was a fantastic preparation that served me well.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Did you ever think about becoming a physician like your father?
I did, and as I said, I chickened out in the anatomy.
So you're like, that was it.
And that was it. It's unfortunate because I've regretted it since, but then my career probably would have been different.
Absolutely.
That doesn't stop me from diagnosing people, and they can't sue me if it's wrong.
How much of an influence was your schooling in Egypt as a child? Tell us about that period.
Egypt at the time was a British protectorate with a king, an Egyptian king. And so the Brits had a school system throughout their colonies and their protectorates. So I went to this girls' school. There was the equivalent boys' school that they were boarding schools and day schools. And a lot of people from the Middle East went to these schools. We had 27 nationalities at the school. It was English, obviously, and French. The teachers used to come from England in 2-year stints until the war hit, and then, of course, they stayed. So we were very lucky about the quality of the education that I received there. And when I finished school, I was too young to be accepted by university in England, so I went to university in Alexandria, which followed the British system, and did pharmacy. And then I went on to England from there and did pharmacology.
And what made you decide to come to the U.S.?
I married a Greek who needed to be supported through college. Isn't everybody?
I guess I've heard that story before. So you said that it's important to find your own mentors, and you said don't expect a mentor to be appointed. Can you talk about some of the mentors that have shaped your career?
Oh, I've had fantastic mentors. One happens to be a Greek woman who was an MD and went to England without speaking any English because her husband was an attaché at the Greek embassy. And she decided she wasn't going to sit and twiddle her thumbs, so she went to the MRC, the Medical Research Council, and said, here I am, what can I do? And she wasn't really looking for a job, she was looking to do something. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, you're an MD, but you also have a degree in chemistry, we'll send you over to chemistry. So she went over to the chemistry section. A fellow called King was designing various compounds, and they designed what called the methonium compounds, which is 2 nitrogens with carbon chains in between. And there was a pentamethonium, 5 carbons, and the nitrogens with the ammoniums at the end, and decamethonium. And these compounds, pentamethonium and hexamethonium, blocked ganglia, and decamethonium was the first synthetic neuromuscular junction blocker. So it was curare, which was the natural thing that the Nobel Prize was awarded. And so she developed these compounds and then said, look, I want to test these. So she went over to the labs and said, do you have any spare animals, frogs, anything? And she started injecting these compounds and sorted out that the first drugs that basically lower blood pressure and the first synthetic neuromuscular junction, and she got all kinds of awards for these things. And but she was very unusual, strong accent, redhead, attractive, insisted we go to the hairdresser once a week. women's medical school, the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine, was just beginning to take in male students. We had one American who had a bachelor's in economics from Harvard, and the rest were giggly 18-year-old females.
Mm-hmm.
And it was challenging.
It sounds like it.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
So, Joan, you went from Ohio State and then to NASA, a move that many of your colleagues questioned. What led you to NASA?
I was at Ohio State teaching in pharmacology, and the chair in physiology was hired by NASA, a fledgling NASA, in the early 60s, very early 60s, to start a group in biology and biomedical sciences. And he looked around and he thought, what do I need? So he needed someone in the stress business. And my research had all been in how the brain regulates the stress response.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, Joan, how would you like to come out to California? And I thought, why not? I'll do my research.
Mm-hmm.
NASA. What's NASA? Never heard of it.
Oh, really?
Not many people had. And there were 6 of us hired. One was circadian rhythms, one was metabolism, one was stress, like myself, and one microbiologist, and so on. So we got together and said, well, okay, we're here to discuss, figure out how gravity or space might or might not affect the human body.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought about gravity as one of the factors, and we had no idea. Nobody knew. I mean, we knew about plants, growing up towards light and the roots growing downward, but humans, I asked my medical colleagues, and they said, why should it have any effect? We're surrounded by gravity, right? We've evolved in gravity. Why should it have any effect?
Mm-hmm.
To this day, the word gravity has not made it into the medical textbooks.
Really?
So you got to NASA Ames, and you're out there doing your research, and you got involved heavily in the work there and then moved to NASA headquarters. Tell us about your work there and how you managed to move up to headquarters in life sciences.
Well, I was very fortunate in my career. I never had to apply for a job. Somehow or other, I was invited to do something, and it happened. And then one day there was an advertisement for the Life Sciences Division director. And my husband said, you will apply, won't you? And I said, why should I? I'm very happy doing what I'm doing, doing human research mostly. And he said, well, because no one's going to pay any attention to you if you don't apply. And I thought, oh, what the heck, I'll apply. And that's how it happened. And I ended up in headquarters, which meant that it was the end of my research career, much as folks had tried to stop me before that in various administrative jobs I had. But I never really stopped doing research. I do research on people all the time. Beware.
I know, I'm a little scared now. She's giving me the eye like, I'm assessing you as we speak.
So up at headquarters, what was your position, and what kind of accounts were you managing up there?
I managed the entire life sciences budget, which included everything bar salaries that came out of another budget. So it was the research budget and the flight budget and the flight operations that had to do with research on flight platforms. Collaborative work. It was very international because I've always collaborated with internationals my entire career. Very collaborative with the science community in the area, which was the prime reason Congress decided to send the research, NASA's research, to California, was the university environment. So having come from that, I emphasized collaboration very closely with NIH. We used to jointly defend budgets for life sciences. We used to have regular meetings. We used to have a NASA NIH advisory committee permanently in life sciences. So it was very active with NSF as well, with other agencies. So the program was exciting. It was applied and it was fundamental from biology, biomedical, life support, human factors. Unfortunately, before I got there, the exobiology had been removed. The astrobiology program went to the space sciences instead of life sciences. But we had a remote sensing and disease prediction, lots of applied work. Very, very exciting. So it was grants to the science community as well as the in-house NASA research programs.
Okay. So what we specifically are talking about today, though, is the effect of gravity and the loss of gravity in free fall on astronauts. For 55 years, we've been flying people in space. They've always gone into this free fall environment. So what are the effects and the countermeasures that we've invented to prevent negative effects on astronauts? They lose muscle and skeletal strength. How do we prevent that? And what kind of experiences do human beings have in this free fall environment?
Well, we started obviously with observations. The program was extremely observational. First, with Shepard coming back after just 15 minutes, and on to all the other Mercury and Gemini astronauts. And every little bit of information was cumulative in our figuring out that, first of all, gravity was more important than we thought, and a requirement. And we could see right away little bits of information that present this composite of what happens without gravity or with minimal gravity, with microgravity, 10 to minus 5, in space. Right away, the vestibular system became a key feature to focus on. Relative dehydration because of the reduction in blood volume and in response to the shift of blood towards the head and the chest, and the sensing that volume was expanded and therefore you needed to get rid of the extra, and you did that by dumping water through urine. Muscle wasting, first because of the dehydration, but then because it was obvious that muscle and bone were atrophied. And then with animal experiments, finding that within 6 hours of flight, protein synthesis in muscle stopped. And then again in rats with the Russians, who were wonderful about inviting us to participate on what we called the parts program. In other words, using whatever parts of animals they were not interested in, what could we do with them? And that became one of the important and rewarding program, plus the collaboration that we developed over the years with them that lasts to this day. That bone, for instance, let me give you an example. Early on, we knew from the Gemini 7 flight that calcium balance was changing. So you're dumping more calcium in the urine, and it wasn't going into the bone. Presumably, it was coming out of the bone. What we could do with the parts program, was the Russians allowed us to inject tetracycline, the antibiotic, in the rat before they flew, and again retrieve the bone after they returned. And literally, as the bone has rings like a tree, and the synthesis of bone was inhibited. So it was the first time that we saw that the synthesis of protein in the muscle, the synthesis of bone. So it was synthesis that was stopped. almost immediately when going into microgravity. The breakdown and the loss then produced a net loss over time. But the main primary thing that I think is often ignored is that the signal for the synthesis was gravity related. And cardiovascular changes, of course, the whole shift of blood, the heart getting smaller, the stroke volume and cardiac output being reduced because it didn't have to pump blood up to the head nearly as much as one does normally sitting or standing on Earth. The endothelium, the lining of the blood vessels, gradually disappears, shrinks with time. Joints, muscle, ligaments, tendons, the collagen is lost. It's not exactly a catabolic state, but it's a wasting state in the sense that it's not made.
Right. And have we come a long way in counteracting that at the space station today? Do the astronauts preserve their muscle and their bone strength?
I don't think so. I think we're flogging the same thing over and over again. And when first of all, we've never flown an astronaut, we've never flown a human without exercise, whether we prescribed it or they voluntarily did it. And even when we prescribed it, as you know very well, astronauts took their own devices, bands or whatever, from the Exogeny in the early days to Scott Parashinsky's devices later. There have been continuous efforts to think. What is fascinating to me is that all the data we have in space is in the presence of the exercise countermeasure. We have no control, if you want to look at it that way, without the exercise countermeasure, except, of course, the individual's own pre-flight data. So there is huge change. And we thought it was going to stabilize, and we're still waiting for that to happen. I have not seen Scott Kelly's, for instance, data. Maybe a lot of people haven't.
I think that's still very early.
It's very early. But that would be very fascinating to see. On the other hand, people like Polyakov.
400 days in space, back in the early 90s.
Well, 14 months, I think, the first time.
Right.
And I've talked to him many times. It took him physically at least 5 years to recover health. I'm not going to say bone, but health.
Joan, NASA is contemplating deep space missions of long durations, and the kinds that we're going to need to reach Mars or its moons, Phobos and Deimos. And astronauts on those missions are going to face multi-year trip times, very long transits between the planets. So it's going to be important for them to succeed in their mission that they stay fit and healthy and strong. And today, astronauts get deconditioned after a long duration space flight. And when they get to Mars gravity, 3/8 that of Earth, they might have trouble actually getting out of their spacecraft and doing exploration activities in those initial days and weeks after they land. So did we learn anything yet from Scott Kelly's and Kel Kornienko's near 1 year stay at the space station? And do you think their data, when it is analyzed, is going to help us eventually succeed at Mars travel?
It will certainly help us decide where we are. I think we need to do a lot of thinking and rethinking and relooking, addressing the problem from a different perspective, in my view. And how did I suddenly become so wise, and why didn't I do it when I was at headquarters? Because since I left NASA, which is 16 years ago, I had time to think, which I didn't have when I worked there. And I have the time to think continuously and readdress and question. The IRAD is useful. It was a device in the right direction, resistive exercise, obviously it was going to be better. But we never really sat down and said, well, what is it that gravity does? How is it perceived? What is the signal the body sees? What is it you need to replace that you're taking away? It's not necessarily, in my view, a rotating spacecraft, a Star Trek device. It's not necessarily that. You can get away, I think, with some other form of providing the stimulation that is the signal. Exactly. Once you understand what the body needs as a signal. And in my view, what the body needs as a signal is low intensity, high frequency, intermittent exposure to something akin to the gravity stimulus. You cannot train one muscle or part of the body or different aspects of the body with exercise, and you certainly can't do it once a day. Because if you did a time course of the changes that occur during spaceflight, and then you did a time course immediately after exercise, you would probably find exactly the same pattern. In other words, the minute you stop exercising, you revert to microgravity. That is not true on Earth. Exercise on Earth is different because the minute you stop, you're still in gravity. Steve Hawley, who was an astronaut and
he was the deputy up at Ames. He was my colleague there at the astronaut corps, right?
Right, exactly. And a very sound thinker, said to me something very interesting one day. He said, you know, Joan, I exercised as hard as I possibly could. The minute I stopped, I felt nothing. I said, what do you mean you felt nothing? He said, well, I was not out of breath. My heart rate was right down. And that made me think that we really should map what happens right after exercise. And I had told him then, which is over 20 years ago. And to this day, I don't think everyone has looked at the after effect, the after response of exercise. I mean, we know what it is like on Earth, but that's not necessarily what happens in space. In space, you're right back to microgravity the instant you stop. So on Earth, we now know that we are perpetual motion machines. We need gravity stimulation. We need to use gravity not just once a day. We know that exercise once a day does not counteract the effects of sitting, for instance. So why should it work in space? You have to have a way of providing the stimulus intermittently all day. And if presumably when you sleep in space, it's anywhere near like sleeping on Earth, which it's not either, but it's closer, then at least 16 hours a day, you have to have the possibility of getting your stimulus intermittently. Now, how long the effect lasts, again, you have to figure out the instant you stop what happens so that you know what the interval is. Now, on the ground, for instance, and that was the last piece of research I ever did at Ames, it takes about 20 to 30 minutes after you stop exercising for many parameters to come back to normal. That doesn't mean that others don't continue. And I naively thought if you stand up, for instance, every 30 minutes, then that might prevent the effects of lying in bed 24 hours continuously. And sure enough, at least on the cardiovascular system, that was better. Just standing up, not standing up and exercising. Standing up was better than walking, which was a big surprise to my statistician who told me, and then, of course, I couldn't believe it. That's counterintuitive from what we know.
Well, currently in space, we have a treadmill, we have an exercise bike, and there's this resistive exercise device, the ARED, which astronauts can use to substitute for weightlifting, if you will. They load up their skeletons that way with this resistive device. So you're saying that there's got to be some other element added to their daily exercise regimen on those machines if we expect them to get to be fit and healthy when they arrive at Mars, then?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what that is? That's the $64 million question. Right?
Well, my bias is that an artificial gravity device that they can get on and off easily many times a day. And there is no such design that I know in the works. And I insist on being user-friendly. Perhaps even more than one astronaut at the same time can jump on and off and not get a lot of, they don't need half an hour or an hour. They need to get the stimulus. So it can be every 10 minutes, it can be every half hour. It depends. It has to be figured out how often. But if on Earth you have to do it every 20 or 30 minutes to maintain normal health, in the presence of gravity, I don't know what it is in space. It may be more often, it may be not. It can alternate with other ways of loading, like the kind of bands and so on that Scott Paraschinsky took up with him. That kind of but that only stimulates certain muscles, and we have to appreciate that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a big muscles you want to maintain. But all of the body needs to be stimulated, and especially the inner ear. I never thought I'd live to say this when in the first, because there was such an emphasis on the vestibular system in NASA in the early days, and always has been. But the vestibular system is ending up being far more important than merely balance and coordination. I'm not underrating balance and coordination. I think you want it and you need it. But it is the clearinghouse for blood pressure regulation. It is a clearinghouse for a whole lot of activities, for muscle, for bone. Now there's research on bone being mediated through the vestibular system. So when the vestibular system goes silent, literally silent, you're in trouble. And you've got to find some way of stimulating. Now, in my wildest dreams, I figure that once we learn what the frequency is required to maintain a viable vestibular system, you might be able to implant some sort of little stimulating device straight to give you your cues straight into the vestibular system. It should not be that hard. And it should not be that hard to find out, but it needs some really systematic research to find out exactly what the body sees on Earth with gravity and what it needs to maintain a functional vestibular system, because you got none up there. I saw Rick Searfoss return from one of his first flights, 9 days in space. And he was being tested on posturography on the balance platform. Eyes open, eyes shut, and we're all watching around, chatting, as we shouldn't have been. And at some point, I see him beginning to lean forward, and then more forward, and more forward. And I thought, oh my goodness, he's going to fall flat on his face. And I rushed to grab him, which is, of course, is ridiculous because he's a big guy and there's no way I could have stopped him. And then others realized what was happening. We all grabbed him. And he shook himself and said, "What happened?" And I said, "You were about to fall flat on your face." He said, I never had any sensation of falling. This was 9 days after being in space. He had lost the sensation of falling, never reflexly put his arms out to protect his fall. And of course, as you well know, from then on, we've had a harness. while you do that test. The maps that are etched in the brain when you develop as a child to tell you where you are relative to the environment disappear. And yes, they come back. And yes, we need to reinforce. What we learn on Earth is that we need to reinforce them throughout life.
Yeah, it took a good 3 days for my coordination and balance to come back after my trip.
Well, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. But it does come back. This is the beauty.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to have driven with me those first 3 days, that's for sure.
No, but then, you wonder how long it would take Scott Kelly.
Yeah. So I know people have talked about creating artificial gravity environments, and it sounds like, especially for some of these long-duration missions, you think that there's potentially a way that we can avoid having to create the spinning spaceship, as you talked about, like on Star Trek. So do you think that we can absolutely find a way to kind of stay away from creating that artificial gravity environment?
I'm convinced.
Okay.
I'm convinced. My human-powered centrifuge was an attempt at that. Very simple, extremely simple. All the other versions you see now, hugely complicated, aversive to using it. Mine was just a plate flush with the shuttle floor, with just a little mound for the motor in the middle, and you could hop on and off. And the important thing that came from the research is that you didn't need exercise in G. Yes, that was good. But you needed passive G, like as in changing posture. So you needed to be able to mimic not only the cardiovascular, but also the pull of gravity, the weighting, just for a minute, 2 minutes.
So like standing up out of bed with the bed rest that you talked about.
Yeah.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience. So, Joan, sarcopenia, which is age-related loss of muscle mass and strength, is a significant health and wellness issue here on Earth. And many studies have documented a diminished anabolic response in older subjects to normally potent anabolic stimuli, such as exercise and food. This blunted anabolic response has been termed anabolic resistance. Do you think that a form of anabolic resistance may be a contributing mechanism that's underlying space flight-induced muscle loss?
A form of anabolic resistance may be at work, but you have to appreciate that what happens when you lie down in bed for hours or you go into space, I presume, is that when you exercise, and it happens very quickly, when you exercise, your natural growth hormone response is absent. Absent. Okay? We know that with age, that also happens. But you can see that with it's not even prolonged bed rest, even a few days of bed rest, and you exercise and you take a blood sample and there's no growth hormone. Or the response is very flat and then progressively gets worse. So it's not only the response of the muscle to the stimulant, but you don't have the stimulant. You don't have the growth factor that promotes the anabolic response. That's just one example. I mean, growth hormone is just one of, as you know, a harmony of factors that work in an anabolic way. And what I'm saying is, which is sad, that we have not established what exactly happens. We just look at an end result and we change what? Nutrition and exercise? There's miles in between of what's going on. We just don't know.
Yeah. And actually understanding what pathways are involved and just trying to delineate that.
Yes.
So I'm going to move away from muscle a little bit. We talked about fluid shift in spaceflight and in microgravity. There's the newly discovered brain lymphatic system and also the glymphatic system, which are key to clearing metabolic junk, essentially, from the brain. Do we know how these systems are impacted by microgravity?
Not a clue.
Okay. What about the peripheral lymphatic system?
Well, some Alan Huggins, for instance, if anybody has done anything, may have looked at the regular lymphatic system, and certainly in bed rest, he has done some research, and it is affected, but it's really primitive. It's unfortunate, but it's primitive. Extremely important, because the circulation depends on the heart pumping. The lymphatic system relies even more heavily on push and pull systems. And once those are absent, what do you do? Nothing.
Yeah.
It stagnates, which means your whole detoxing system is fouled up. How long does it take before you get into real trouble? When it comes to the G lymphatics, which I think is a very exciting piece of research, probably one of the most exciting things in the recent years, that's only just been discovered, really. It was a few months ago.
Yeah, it wasn't long ago.
No. And they're beginning to identify which segment of sleep it's most active. So if you get sleep deprived in a way that portion of sleep is not, you're deprived of that aspect of sleep, then it really fouls up. Well, we don't know what the relationship of the changes in the sleep pattern, not to mention the G lymphatics, what happens in space, because I would expect huge changes. The aspect that your head has no weight in space, you have no sensation of putting your head down, as we do here on Earth. We do not know what gravity pulling on the head in the G sub x direction has on this system, for instance. That's easy to do.
I've even seen a recent study that came out talking about the glymphatic system and saying that which side of the body that you sleep on and which side your head is on with respect to laying on the pillow actually has an impact on how well waste is cleared out. So like you're saying, if
it's mechanical.
You have no pull, then
it's the mechanical aspect of gravity.
Yeah.
And the beauty of it is that it's, first of all, the G lymphatic system was not done in people sitting up and sleeping, like we do on airplanes or standing up in the army or whatever. I guess they don't do that anymore. But the G lymphatic system has been identified in someone who is lying down. When you're not lying down in space, ever.
Yeah, exactly. And then you're talking about long duration missions too, where there's a very long period of time where you're not getting that impact.
And all these impediments to detoxification throughout the body result in inflammation. And in my view, there's nothing new, I suppose. The syndrome, if you want to look at it that way, in space is one of massive inflammation, not to mention the stress.
Yeah, just like a chronic inflammation.
Chronic inflammation.
Yeah.
And everything, when we talk about exploration and long-duration missions, the first thing we have to do is re-look at the environment. There's inadequate light intensity. There's the light cycles are altered. The influence of gravity on the head and the sleep is not sleep as we know it. That's just peripheral, not to mention the accumulation of carbon dioxide because the system doesn't clear it. The whole life support system has to be looked at again. These are crucial to the design of an exploration mission before we even begin to think about the consequences.
The consequences and also potential countermeasures. So essentially, if you can clean up the environment first, and then, because what you don't want to do is load up on...
What's the problem? You want to fix the problem.
Right.
What is it you're taking away from the body?
Right. That makes perfect sense. So I have another question specific to the brain. So increased white matter and hyperintensities. These have been associated with hypobaric exposures in U-2 pilots and altitude chamber operators. And although astronauts have similar hypobaric exposure pressures as U-2 pilot population, the astronauts have far fewer exposures, and each exposure would be associated with a much lower level of decompression stress, or should be, due to rigorous countermeasures such as oxygen pre-breathe prior to extravehicular activity, and that would prevent decompression sickness. So this is one of the things that they thought was key in the development of these white matter hyperintensities, especially in the U-2 pilots and even in chamber operators, that it had to do with some kind of gas emboli that was passing over into the brain. Consequently, it is believed that the white matter hyperintensity burden in the astronaut population would be less than in U-2 pilots because they have this lower decompression risk. However, a recent study has actually shown a significantly higher rate of these white matter lesions in astronauts than in the U-2 pilot population. Even more interesting is that there are no differences between astronauts who underwent extravehicular activity or spacewalk versus those who did not. And so you kind of start to wonder why astronauts who experience less frequent and less stressful hypobaric exposures, less decompression stress, face a much higher incidence of these white matter hyperintensities than the U-2 pilots or even the hypobaric chamber operators. And it's been proposed that additional mechanisms beyond hypobaric exposure are likely working here. We don't really know what yet, but do you have any thoughts on this?
I think we need to, it's very early days, I gather, in identifying these changes in astronauts. It's got to be done systematically and related to duration, repeated exposures, ground controls in astronauts who have never flown. What is the progression of this observation, of this evidence, so that we can begin to map what it might be related to other than pressure, oxygen changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it is fascinating. It is very interesting that it happens in the U-2 pilots. And again, I don't know, in U-2 pilots, it must be hard to see, a naive U-2 pilot to a long-term U-2 pilot. It hasn't hampered, as far as I know, their performance. Is there a higher incidence in brain disease in U-2 pilots? I don't think so. Maybe, I was going to say maybe the alcohol protects.
That'll be next out, probably.
Speaking of nutrition.
Yes.
Yeah, so we'll move on. Let's talk about nutrition in space flight and the role that it might play. So you talked about, astronauts kind of experiencing this almost kind of chronic global inflammation. Would it make sense for NASA to explore something like a ketogenic diet that reduces this global inflammation for astronauts?
Absolutely. I think it's crucial that the astronauts should go on a ketogenic diet, and you can do it even before you do the research. We know that people don't die from going on ketogenic diets here on Earth. There's no reason that the astronauts should suffer by going on ketogenic diets in space. And there is a good chance that it will protect them. There's a lot of evidence on Earth about the benefits now of ketogenic diets, preventing a variety of conditions, including inflammation. And as a precautionary approach, I believe that astronauts should go on a ketogenic diet, especially as part of a long-duration exposure exploration mission. There is some evidence, which I have always been interested in, with comparisons with hibernation and hibernating animals.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, hibernating animals, bears, to be specific, mammals, to be specific, don't lose muscle while they're hibernating, don't lose bone while they're hibernating. Body temperature drops just a little bit. They use up they rely on fat for their energy. They breathe more slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And something I learned recently, they even go through pregnancy while they're hibernating, which is fascinating sort of preservation system.
Speaking of which, we know that a much shorter form of hibernation, which is not even really hibernation, but we know that sleep is critical for human performance here on Earth. And we'd actually talked just a little bit before when we were talking about the glymphatic system, about kind of clearing out, giving the brain a chance to clear out metabolites and waste. Are there sleep issues for astronauts?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Astronauts, if you ask them, even when the monitoring of electrical activity has been done and recorded and appears to be normal, even when they have taken, as in Skylab, 4 different sleep medications, including chloral hydrate that went out with the Middle Ages, they had trouble sleeping, A, and B, and most important, they did not feel refreshed when they woke up. And that feeling refreshed when you wake up, I'm sure involves the Glymphatic system and detoxing the brain. But who knows what else? And it's not just the deprivation, hours, less of sleep. It is the quality of the sleep and the functions of sleep that are not performed in the proper way to provide the best quality of sleep where they feel refreshed. That is important for their cognitive function. It's not only important to be able to walk on Mars when you get there, because you might be able to recover over time by enhancing the gravity, the threshold gravity that you have on Mars, some way, by load bearing or your backpack, your life support pack, or whatever. You can enhance the gravity you got there, but it's the cognitive functions that have to be maintained, and that is a whole different aspect, and sleep is fundamental to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't always listen to podcasts, but when I do, I listen to STEM Talk, interviewing the most interesting people in the world of science and technology. Stay curious, my friends.
Well, Joan, your research findings about the effects of microgravity on astronauts in space have implications for how we live back here on Earth. And talk about that connection, if you can.
Yes. I firmly believe that space has really revealed a whole lot about how gravity affects us here on Earth, how important it is to well-being, and how we should or could use it to maintain health. We are, as you know, living longer, some of us. But are we healthier? And the answer is no, we're not. The Center for Disease Control tells us 2/3 of the population are classified as unhealthy. And if you look at what the space research is telling us, not just from astronauts in space, but from its ground simulation of lying in bed continuously for 24 hours, you come to the conclusion that the similarities are very real between the effects of space and the effects of lying in bed continuously. And that's why we use it as a model. And what has transpired in the last few years is the realization that the more hours we sit, and we are sitting more and more and more as we humans get creative about developing appliances and remote controls and all kinds of, and cars that drive themselves, and chairs that lift you up so you don't have to exert yourself to do it. We are moving less and less and less and less. And the less we move, the more like astronauts we become. And on the other side, the research now that is gradually being leaked, shall we say, that in fact the changes, for instance, in bone loss from 1% per year that here on Earth to 10%, 20% a year in space has found for bone tenfold, or so it's been said, tenfold greater loss in space than it is on Earth. Now, from that, we can draw a relationship line between space, bed rest continuously, sitting for hours on end, and aging, which is the ultimate end product of inactivity or lack of using gravity. In one case, you don't have it. In the bed rest, its effect is minimized, and sitting, it's even more minimized. And from age 20 on, peak development on, we sit and sit and sit more and more. And we are perpetual motion machines, or we should be. We're designed to move. We're designed to be exposed to gravity at intermittent basis. And so what we have learned is the importance of gravity on health, on just fundamental health. And also, interestingly, that 1 time a day exercise, which, is, by the way, does not include weekends most of the time, is not enough to counteract the absence of movement throughout the day. And that, in my view, what happens is the following. I think gravity, if you take it into its fundamentals, is the stimulus for the vestibular system. Now I'm hypothesizing, okay? So indulge me. Gravity is the fundamental stimulus for the vestibular system. If it's the vestibular system that you want to maintain, then you need to provide the kind of stimulus that is most relevant. And what is most relevant in that is the change in posture as a basic signal. And the change in posture, movement, is the fundamental aspect. Movement all day of low intensity, high frequency, throughout the daylight hours.
Why the daylight hours?
Because, as the world turns, we have night and we have day. And during the night, what do you do?
That's when you're supposed to be resting.
You lie... I don't know if it's rest. You lie down.
Yeah.
And you lie down, you have G sub X, minimizing the influence of gravity, when a whole bunch of activities, because sleep is not an inactive part of the day, when a whole lot of cleaning up activities, it's when your cleaners come in and clean out your office and prepare, then stock up and prepare for the next day. So then as the earth turns, you have day. And what do you do? That's a question.
Well, you should be moving, but most of us sit at a desk.
First you wake up.
Yeah.
After you wake up, what do you do?
Stand up.
Bingo.
Yeah.
You stand up. It's the first thing you do. Now, you think it's important? It better be.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like a great way to ask you about your new book, Sitting Kills, Moving Heals, because, we do live in an inactive society where we have very few physical demands during our workday. And, we sit too much and we move around too little, just as you've been saying. So talk a little about your book's title, Sitting Kills and Moving Heals, and the primary themes of the book and how the public has reacted to it.
The public has reacted to. I was shocked when the publisher came up with that. I thought, oh my goodness, as a scientist, I can't say things like that, like sitting kills. But he was right, and the title brought attention to the book because it is so shocking. And the other thing that shocked the publisher himself is that it has maintained its interest among the public. In fact, the interest has gradually grown as the realization has come through that there is something there that we can learn from. I'm very proud of the last chapter in the book that nobody reads because it's the first chapter. I call it gravity therapy because I believe that gravity can be used as therapy. And it's the first time, as far as I know, that anyone has looked at it from that perspective. What are the circumstances, whether it is in people with attention deficit disorder or cerebral palsy, children born with brain damage that cannot sense gravity because, I don't know if they can sense gravity or not. What I do know is that they don't have the opportunity to perceive gravity in the vertical direction, and therefore their development and their growth is hampered. So that's extremely important. But the other aspect is bringing attention to the fact that the space experience has taught us all about our environment, the importance of gravity to health and activity and growth and development here on Earth. And there's a lot more coming where that is. By the way, I have a new book coming out called Designed to Move.
Love it. And when should that be coming out?
I don't know. The publisher is editing. Like now, it should come out this year.
Exciting. Okay. So Joan, tell us more about your cultural heritage and how does that promote longevity?
I think it's been overrated. The Greeks are lucky in living in a place that spontaneously they're moving. The other thing is, I don't know if you've watched the Greeks speak and how they move their arms. Well, that's all part of using gravity. And the social aspect, the movement aspect, the diet, which is mostly ketogenic, with small digressions to the sweet tooth, is conducive to longevity. The expression, the overt expression of anger, disagreement, which is not subdued and incorporated psychologically.
You're not bottling
You're
these
not
things up.
bottling it in.
Yeah.
And then you're perfectly all right. So So there's a lot more to it and the hiking aspect. Lots of dry, rough terrain country. The city people, the urban Greeks, are unhealthy, and they're not living as longer. You find the longevity in the rural areas, which is true also, by the way, around the world. It's not, there's evidence that the urbanization has not been good for us. And you go out in the country and you eat from what you plant, and your animals are free-ranging or grass-fed or whatever, and you don't rely on packaged goods. So
absolutely, you get your sunshine. You tend to be
get
more
your
active.
sunshine.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
Yes, sunshine and clean air.
That's very important. So, Joan, what do you like to do in your free time?
I like mysteries, and I like mysteries because I feel science is a mystery, and I approach science from the mystery perspective. I think I'm a sleuth that solves a problem. And I try to approach it in a similar way. So I like Sherlock Holmes. I like Agatha Christie mysteries, good, healthy kind of stuff, not the gore and chase kind of mysteries. But I love to see a scientific paper that shows me a discovery by a process of thinking, questioning, sorting out the bigger picture. So I don't like, for instance, studying the human body in pieces, a little bit of muscle and a little bit of this and a little bit of system of there. But it is a whole. And you have to look at the whole picture and then figure out how your approach can solve the problem.
So, Joan, thank you so much for the wonderful discussion today and for joining us. And I'm really excited about your lecture this evening here at IHMC.
Thank you very much for having me. I am very excited.
And I want you to know, Joan.
Yes, Tom.
I stood up through the whole talk today.
Oh, good for you. Maybe the audience will stand up.
I'm sure they will with their applause.
We'll put that in a show note. So how's that sound?
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is Dawn Kernagis. Thank you so much for joining us, Joan, and we'll see you next time on STEM Talk.
And this is Tom Jones. Thank you, Joan. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
That interview was exceptionally rich in useful information. Our willingness to interact appropriately with gravity by movement and exercise will substantially determine the quality of our health as we age.
We have now had 3 interviews related to gravity. 2 focused on the first direct detection of gravity waves, and now this episode, which discussed the health effects of gravity on Earth and in space. I invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage, where one can find the show notes for this episode and find pointers to Joan's books and other information. stemtalk.us.
Dawn, you and Tom Jones did a great job on this interview. Joan seemed to really enjoy coming on STEM Talk.
Thanks, Ken. She was really a lot of fun to hang out with in the IHMC podcasting studio. This is Dawn Kernagis signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until next time we meet on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.